Welcome to Podkey Slopcast, where AI power, politics, and workplace reality all collide. One export control order, one fast model shutdown, and suddenly the argument isn't just about AI safety. It's about who gets to define risk, how much evidence they have to show, and what happens when technical disputes get routed through political power. The confirmed core here is straightforward. The US Treasury issued an export control directive suspending access to Anthropic's Fable 5 and Mythos 5 for all foreign nationals, and Anthropic pulled the models within about 90 minutes. That speed matters. It tells you the government had a lever that worked immediately, and it tells you Anthropic either thought resistance was futile or too risky to attempt in the moment. Where the story gets murkier is the justification. The administration says this was a last resort after hours of trying to get Anthropic to cooperate. Anthropic says that account is wrong, that it wasn't asked to beg for anything, and that it wasn't given details about the alleged threat. Those claims can't both be fully true as stated. Maybe officials believed they were signaling urgency, while Anthropic believed it was being ordered around without evidence. Maybe one side is shading the timeline for public sympathy. Right now, the public record supports the fact of the shutdown more clearly than the narrative about how unavoidable it was. That's why the open letter from cybersecurity leaders matters. Alex Samos and others aren't saying risk is imaginary. They're saying if the government is going to cut off access to frontier models, it needs a transparent and scientific process for assessing risk, especially when defensive security research may get hit too. That argument has weight, because export controls are blunt instruments. If a model can help with cyber abuse, it can also help defenders understand threats faster. Restricting access may reduce some misuse, but it can also slow down the people trying to harden systems. The second-order issue is competition. The letter warns that Chinese open-weight models are only months behind. If that's even roughly right, then a policy built around restricting one US lab could weaken domestic research without changing the global availability of comparable capability for very long. That doesn't prove the controls are wrong. It does mean the burden of proof should be fairly high, because the trade-off isn't safety versus chaos. It's one risk profile versus another. The reported catalyst was a jailbreak shown by a trusted partner, widely reported to be Amazon. The claim is that the jailbreak bypassed Fable's guardrails and got the model to discuss software security bugs. Anthropic itself reportedly treated the issue as serious, which is important. Companies usually know when a demo exposes a meaningful weakness versus when it's mostly theater. But the outside criticism also matters. People like Eric Voorhees and engineer Corey Ward argued the jailbreak was narrow and did not enable exploit code generation. Amazon, notably, has not publicly released the full details of what it demonstrated. So what can we actually say? There was some kind of bypass, senior officials took it seriously, but the public still doesn't know whether this was a broad break in the model's safety architecture or a limited edge case that looked alarming in a closed-door briefing. And that distinction is everything. A narrow jailbreak can still justify a patch. It does not automatically justify an emergency-style export restriction affecting all foreign nationals to make that leap. You'd want evidence that the capability materially changes offensive cyber risk at scale. The reporting says Amazon's warning was a primary catalyst for the rapid government decision. That raises a separate governance question. Should one private partner's demonstration be enough to trigger national controls this fast, especially when the details remain undisclosed? Reporting names officials including Scott Bessent, Susie Wiles, and John Cairncross as pushing for the shutdown and portraying Anthropic as uncooperative. Anthropic, for its part, frames the order as politically motivated retaliation tied to earlier disagreements. That retaliation claim is plausible enough to investigate, but it's still a claim. What's better supported is that this episode sits at the intersection of technical judgment and political power, and those systems often move at very different speeds. Commentators like Miles Brindage and Colin Cameron argue this reflects gaps in technical expertise inside the administration. That's believable in the abstract because frontier model risks are hard even for specialists to evaluate. But lack of expertise isn't the only explanation. Officials may also have had incentives to act decisively rather than be accused later of ignoring a warning. That incentive structure matters a lot. If you're a government official and a partner says a leading model can be jailbroken on cyber topics, the personal downside of underreacting can look much worse than the downside of overreacting. Bureaucracies often choose the option that is easiest to defend after the fact. The problem is that overreaction has costs too. It can distort the market, reward firms that cultivate political trust over technical transparency, and make future labs less willing to disclose vulnerabilities candidly if they think disclosure could trigger a punitive spectacle. Then there's the Dario Amadei angle. White House sources circulated the line that he was unavailable at a wellness retreat, and that quickly turned into the bathrobe meme version of the story. Critics called it a linguistic kill shot. And that description makes sense. It compresses a complicated institutional dispute into a character story about an absent, out-of-touch founder. That's sticky, and it's hard to rebut once it lands. Whether it was deliberate spin or just irresistible political gossip, the effect is the same. It shifts attention away from the exact technical evidence and toward the optics of leadership competence. Investors' warning that the dispute may not resolve without Amadei's personal intervention tells you something else. In frontier AI, even companies that sound institutionally mature can still be heavily founder-mediated in crises. That can reassure people who want one accountable decision-maker, but it's also a concentration risk. Ben Thompson's broader critique is worth sitting with. He compares Anthropic's safety framing to companies that package self-serving control as user benefit and argues Anthropic can sound like it believes it uniquely understands superintelligence risk. That doesn't mean Anthropic is wrong about specific risks. It means the posture itself deserves scrutiny. Any company claiming special moral authority over technology with nation-state level implications is asking for unusual trust. The contradiction is obvious. If a lab says these systems are dangerous enough to justify extraordinary caution, that may strengthen the case for listening to it, but it may also strengthen the case for not letting that same lab define the rules by itself. So the real question isn't whether safety matters. Of course it does. The question is who adjudicates safety claims, by what evidence, and under what checks when private incentives, public fear, and geopolitical competition are all in the room. The KPMG study sounds unrelated at first, but it actually grounds this whole conversation. They looked at 1.4 million workplace AI interactions and found that the highest impact users treat AI like a reasoning partner. They frame problems, iterate, and collaborate instead of hunting for magic prompt tricks. That finding matters because it cuts through some of the mythology around AI use. A lot of value seems to come from ordinary but disciplined habits, not from secret wizardry. And KPMG says those habits are teachable at scale. For companies, that suggests many are still underusing AI. The bottleneck may be workflow design and training, not raw model access alone. It also sharpens the policy stakes. If advanced models are increasingly useful as reasoning collaborators in normal work, then blunt restrictions have wider economic consequences than the headline security dispute might suggest. At the same time, wider usefulness can also widen the blast radius if guardrails genuinely fail. So again, it comes back to calibration. The evidence for broad economic upside is getting stronger. The evidence for catastrophic misuse in this specific Anthropic episode remains less transparent than the rhetoric around it. The hardest part of this story is that several concerns can be real at once: jailbreak risk, political spin, overbroad controls, and genuine uncertainty about fast-moving models. What holds up best so far is the need for a clearer public standard before emergency powers reshape access to major AI systems. Thanks for listening to Podkey Slopcast. This episode was generated by Podkey. Create your own at podkey.fm.